The sound echoed through my kitchen like a gunshot, though it was only my son's palm against my weathered cheek. The sting burned less than the silence that followed, heavy as storm clouds gathering over our small town. I stood there, 73 years old, my hand instinctively rising to touch the heat spreading across my face, while Michael towered over me with eyes I no longer recognized. "You're nothing but a burden, Mom," he spat, his voice carrying the same cruelty I'd heard him use on telemarketers and waitresses. "A pathetic old woman clinging to a house you can't even maintain." The morning light streaming through my curtains seemed to dim as his words settled into the spaces between us. I could smell the coffee I'd made for him still brewing, the scent now bitter in the charged air. His wife Sandra stood behind him, arms crossed, her designer purse clutched like a weapon. She'd been the one to suggest this conversation, this intervention as she called it. The same woman who'd smiled sweetly at Christmas dinners while calculating the value of my grandmother's china. Now her mask had slipped, revealing the contempt she'd always harbored beneath her practiced politeness. "We've found a lovely assisted living facility," Sandra said, her voice honey-sweet with false concern. "Much more appropriate for someone your age. You'll be so much happier there." She pulled out a glossy brochure, the kind that promises dignity while stripping it away. The faces on the cover smiled emptily, surrounded by beige walls and artificial flowers, a world designed to contain rather than nurture. I watched my only child gather his coat, his movements sharp with finality. 27 years I'd raised him alone after his father died, working double shifts at the hospital to pay for his college, his wedding, his down payment on that house across town. Now he stood in my doorway like a stranger, his face set against me with the hardness of stone. "We'll be back next week with the papers," he said without looking back. The door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than his slap ever could. The days blurred together after that morning, each one carrying the weight of his absence like stones in my pockets. I would catch myself setting 2 coffee cups on the counter, then remember the emptiness that had taken root in my home. The neighbors still waved when I tended my garden, but their smiles carried a different quality now, the careful kindness reserved for the forgotten. Michael never called. Not on my birthday, not on Christmas, not even when Mrs. Henderson from next door mentioned seeing me at the grocery store, buying single portions of everything like a woman learning to live in smaller spaces. I would sit in my living room sometimes, running my fingers over the photographs on the mantel, tracing the outline of his face through the years, gap-toothed at 7, proud in his graduation cap, radiant on his wedding day. The assisted living brochure remained on my kitchen table for months, a reminder of how easily love can transform into transaction. I would stare at those empty smiles and wonder if this was how children learn to see their parents, as problems to be solved, burdens to be managed. The house seemed to echo differently now, as if the walls themselves remembered the harshness of that morning. Some evenings, when the light faded just right, I would remember other versions of Michael. The boy who brought me dandelions as if they were roses, who sat beside me through endless nights when fever burned through his small body. That child still existed somewhere beneath the man who'd struck me, but the distance between who he was and who he'd become stretched wider with each passing season. I began to understand something during those quiet years, how invisibility could be both curse and gift. People stopped expecting things from me, stopped seeing me as anything more than the elderly woman who kept a tidy yard and paid her bills on time. But in that invisibility I found space to remember who I'd been before I became Michael's mother, before I became anyone's anything. In the silence I began to hear my own voice again. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, wedged between advertisements and bills like a secret someone had tried to hide. The return address bore the seal of the Veterans Administration, formal and official in a way that made my heart quicken. I held it for a long moment before opening, feeling the weight of memory pressing against my chest like an old wound awakening. Inside was notification of a ceremony, a recognition dinner for female veterans who'd served during times when women's contributions were rarely acknowledged. My name appeared on the invitation in careful script: Eleanor May Thompson, Captain, United States Army Nurse Corps, 1968 to 1972. The woman I'd been before marriage reshaped me, before motherhood became my only identity, before age convinced everyone, including myself, that I was small. I walked to my bedroom closet, pushing aside the practical dresses and sensible shoes to reach the cedar box I hadn't opened in years. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid, releasing the scent of preservation and time. There it was, my dress uniform, pressed and perfect, waiting as if it knew this day would come. Beside it lay my commendations, my nursing certification, the photograph of me standing with my unit in Da Nang. That woman in the photograph stared back at me with steady eyes, her spine straight beneath the weight of responsibility she'd carried. Captain Thompson had supervised a 40-bed trauma unit, had held dying soldiers while rockets fell around the hospital, had made decisions that meant the difference between life and death. She'd been strong, competent, unshakable, qualities that seemed impossible now in this quiet house where my son's absence still echoed. But as I held that uniform against my body, feeling the familiar weight of authority in its fabric, something shifted inside me. The woman who'd saved lives in a war zone hadn't disappeared. She'd simply been buried beneath years of being told she was less than enough. The recognition ceremony was in 3 weeks. For the first time in 7 years, I had somewhere important to go. The dress uniform still fit, though it carried different stories now in the lines around my eyes, the silver threading through my hair. I stood before my bedroom mirror, watching decades collapse as I pinned my rank insignia to my collar. Captain Thompson looked back at me with an authority I'd forgotten I possessed, her shoulders squared against whatever battles lay ahead. The ceremony took place at the Grand Hotel downtown, in a ballroom filled with women who'd served in silence and shadows. We were a gathering of grandmothers and widows now, but as we stood for the national anthem, something electric passed between us, the recognition of shared strength, of service that had been overlooked but never forgotten. When they called my name, announcing my unit and commendations, I felt the audience's respectful attention settle around me like armor. Captain Thompson supervised critical care operations under combat conditions, the announcer's voice carried across the room. She received the Bronze Star for valor after remaining at her post during a direct attack on her field hospital, continuing to treat casualties while under fire. The words felt strange applied to me now, this small woman who'd been dismissed as a burden. But they were true words, recorded in official documents that bore my signature in steady ink. After the ceremony, younger veterans approached me with questions about my service, their eyes bright with genuine interest. They asked about the challenges of being a woman in combat zones, about the patients I'd saved, about the strength it took to serve when the country barely acknowledged women belonged in uniform. For the first time in years, someone was seeing me, really seeing me, as more than an aging inconvenience. I drove home through the quiet streets of our small town, my medals catching the streetlight through the windshield. The house looked different when I pulled into the driveway, not smaller but more mine somehow. I was still Michael's mother, still the woman he'd struck and abandoned, but I was also Captain Thompson. I was both the invisible grandmother and the decorated veteran. And perhaps it was time the world and my son remembered that. From my kitchen window I could see Michael's house 3 blocks away, its windows glowing warmly in the evenings like promises I was no longer invited to share. Sometimes I would spot him in the grocery store, his cart filled with name brands and expensive cuts of meat, Sandra beside him planning menus for dinner parties I'd never attend. He moved through our small town like a successful man, which I suppose he was, regional manager at the insurance company, member of the country club, respected in all the ways that mattered to people who measured worth in possessions. I learned to time my errands to avoid these encounters, not from shame but from the peculiar pain of seeing someone you created become a stranger. When we did cross paths at the post office or the pharmacy, his eyes would slide past me as if I were furniture, something familiar but unimportant. Sandra would offer a tight smile that never reached her eyes, the kind of acknowledgement you might give to someone you couldn't quite place. They'd bought a boat that summer, a sleek white thing they moored at the lake. I heard about it from Mrs. Henderson, who kept track of neighborhood developments like a gentle spy. "Must be nice," she'd said over our garden fence, "to have that kind of money to throw around." I nodded and continued deadheading my roses, letting the irony settle between us unspoken. My monthly pension check was larger than Michael's salary, but he'd never thought to wonder about my resources. The assisted living facility they'd chosen for me had closed the previous year, financial difficulties, according to the newspaper notice. I kept the clipping in my kitchen drawer, not as vindication but as reminder that even the most confident plans could crumble. I wondered if they'd noticed, if they'd bothered to drive past the empty building with its boarded windows and realize their neat solution had evaporated. In the evenings I would sit on my front porch and watch the neighborhood settle into darkness. Children played in yards where I'd once been welcome, their laughter carrying on summer air that tasted of possibility. I wasn't bitter bitterness required more energy than I cared to spend. Instead, I was waiting, watching, remembering what it felt like to be underestimated. In war, we'd learned that quiet observation often preceded decisive action. The lawyer's office smelled of leather and old money, exactly the kind of place where important decisions crystallized into binding documents. James Morrison had been handling my affairs for 15 years, ever since Harold passed, but this was the first time I'd asked him to do something that felt like warfare rather than simple estate planning. "Are you certain about this, Eleanor?" he asked, his pen hovering over papers that would reshape everything. "It's quite a substantial change." His concern was genuine. We'd known each other's families for decades, but there was also curiosity in his eyes. The quiet widow he'd helped with routine matters was revealing depths he'd never suspected. I thought of Michael's confident dismissal, the way he'd calculated my worth in terms of burden rather than contribution. "Quite certain," I said, signing my name with the same steady hand that had once signed death certificates and discharge papers. The documents made it official. My property, my accounts, my carefully accumulated wealth would be distributed exactly as I chose, not as anyone expected or demanded. The real estate appraiser came the following week, a young woman with kind eyes who seemed surprised by what she found. My modest house sat on 2 acres of prime development land, inherited from my parents when such things seemed worthless. The property value had increased dramatically over the decades, something I'd known but never discussed. She walked the boundaries with genuine appreciation, understanding that sometimes treasure hides in plain sight. My financial advisor, a different young woman who respected experience more than age, helped me organize accounts I'd maintained separately for years. Military pension, nursing pension, Harold's life insurance, investments I'd made quietly while everyone assumed I lived on Social Security. The numbers were significant enough to surprise even me when laid out so precisely. I wasn't wealthy by city standards, but in our small town I was considerably more comfortable than anyone imagined. The bank safety deposit box contained documents Michael had never seen, my discharge papers, commendations, copies of performance evaluations that used words like exceptional and invaluable. I spread them across the kitchen table that still bore the stain of that morning's coffee, when my son had reduced me to nothing more than a problem requiring solution. These papers told a different story, one written in official letterhead and formal recognition. Michael's phone call came on a Thursday, his voice tight with the particular frustration of someone whose plans had met unexpected obstacles. He'd been researching assisted living facilities, new ones since their original choice had failed, and something had triggered questions about my finances. Perhaps they'd required asset statements, or maybe Sandra had grown curious about funding arrangements. Either way, the comfortable assumptions they'd built their plans around were showing cracks. "Mom, we need to talk about your financial situation," he said without preamble, the way he might address a problematic client. "There are some things that don't add up." I could hear Sandra in the background, her voice a sharp counterpoint to his measured tone. They discovered something, enough to disturb their certainty, not enough to understand the full picture. I invited them for coffee, the same ritual I'd offered countless times before they'd decided I was beneath their notice. "Saturday morning," I said, setting a time that would allow me to prepare properly. I spent Friday cleaning house with the thoroughness of someone expecting important guests, though I suspected they would see only what they'd always seen, an aging woman in a modest home, surrounded by outdated furniture and fading photographs. The weather report promised storms for the weekend, the kind of late summer tempest that could reshape landscapes overnight. I watched the clouds gathering from my kitchen window, feeling something similar building in my chest. For 7 years I'd been the woman they'd dismissed, the burden they'd calculated and discarded. But storms have a way of revealing what was always there, hidden beneath deceptively calm surfaces. I pressed my dress uniform one more time, hanging it in the front closet where it would be ready when needed. My medals sat in their presentation box on the dining room table, catching afternoon light through windows I'd cleaned until they sparkled. The legal documents were organized in neat folders, each one representing choices I'd made without their knowledge or approval. Everything was ready. Now I simply had to wait for the storm to arrive. They arrived precisely at 10, Michael's jaw set with determination, Sandra clutching a leather portfolio like a shield. I poured coffee into cups Harold had given me for our 20th anniversary, watching them settle into chairs that suddenly seemed too small for their certainty. The storm had begun during the night, rain drumming against windows with increasing intensity, as if the weather itself was preparing for what came next. "Mom, we've been doing some research," Michael began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "About your assets, your property value. We think you've been confused about your financial situation." Sandra nodded supportively, pulling papers from her portfolio with the efficiency of someone delivering an intervention. I let them talk, explaining their discoveries with the patience of adults addressing a child who'd misunderstood something important. They'd learned about the property value, found hints of investments, discovered enough to make them recalculate, but not enough to understand the full scope of their miscalculation. Their voices carried that particular mix of concern and condescension that accompanies conversations with elderly relatives who can no longer manage their own affairs. "We're prepared to help," Sandra said, her smile bright with false compassion. "To take over managing your finances, make sure you're not taken advantage of." She slid documents across my kitchen table, power of attorney forms, investment management agreements, papers that would transfer control of my life into their capable hands. The same hands that had pushed assisted living brochures at me 7 years ago. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 73 years and the strength of everything they'd never bothered to discover about me. "I think it's time you met someone," I said, walking to the front closet with deliberate steps. When I returned wearing my dress uniform, metals gleaming against navy fabric, the silence in my kitchen was complete except for rain against glass and the soft intake of Sandra's surprised breath. Michael's face went through several changes as I stood before him in full military dress, confusion, recognition, something that might have been shame if he'd allowed it room to grow. Sandra's carefully organized papers seemed suddenly insignificant scattered across my table, their neat calculations meaningless in the face of what she was finally seeing. "Captain Eleanor May Thompson," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd earned in trauma units and combat zones. "Bronze Star recipient, supervisor of critical care operations, nursing administrator." I opened the presentation box on my dining table, letting them see commendations they'd never known existed, achievements they'd never thought to ask about. "This is who you've been trying to manage." The financial documents came next, account statements, investment portfolios, property assessments that revealed the true scope of what they'd attempted to claim. My military pension alone exceeded their household income, supplemented by nursing benefits, investment returns, and property values that had grown steadily over decades of careful stewardship. I wasn't the burden they'd calculated me to be. I was, in fact, considerably more financially secure than they were. "I don't understand," Michael said, though his voice suggested he was beginning to. "Why didn't you tell us? Why let us think?" He gestured helplessly at the papers Sandra had brought, their careful intervention plans now revealed as presumptuous and unnecessary. "We thought we were helping." "You thought you were solving a problem," I corrected gently. "You never asked what kind of help I might actually need or whether I needed help at all." The storm outside was beginning to calm, rain settling into steady rhythm against windows that framed this moment of revelation. "You saw an old woman and assumed she was helpless. You never saw the veteran, the professional, the person who'd been taking care of herself long before you were born." Sandra's composure finally cracked, tears mixing with mascara as she stared at the evidence of her own miscalculation. "We didn't know," she whispered. "You seemed so ordinary." The word hung between us like an admission of guilt, revealing how thoroughly they dismissed me without ever really looking. Ordinary, as if service and sacrifice and strength could be measured by appearances rather than actions. The papers they'd brought went into my fireplace that evening, their edges curling and blackening as flames consumed plans made without my knowledge or consent. I watched them burn while sipping tea from Harold's favorite mug, feeling something lighter settle in my chest where resentment had lived for 7 years. Michael calls now, hesitant conversations that carry the weight of his embarrassment and something that might grow into respect given time. He's begun asking questions about my service, about the woman I was before he knew me as his mother. These conversations are careful things, built slowly like trust between strangers learning to become family again. Sandra sends flowers on my birthday, expensive arrangements that smell of apology. I've decided to keep the house, these walls that witness both dismissal and recognition, that sheltered me through years of invisibility and the moment I chose to be seen again. The property will go where I decide it should go, when I decide the time is right. Not because I'm anyone's burden, but because I'm someone with choices to make and the wisdom to make them well. The Veterans Organization has asked me to speak at their next gathering, about service, about the unique challenges women faced in combat zones, about the strength it takes to remain standing when the world tries to make you small. I've accepted, understanding that my story might help other women remember their own power, their own worth beyond the roles others assign them. Some evenings, I sit on my front porch and watch the neighborhood children play, their laughter carrying promises of futures we can't predict. I wave to neighbors who see me differently now, not as the woman whose son abandoned her, but as Captain Thompson who serves on the Veterans Memorial Committee, who speaks at community events, who exists fully in the present rather than hiding in the shadows of dismissal. The storm that brought recognition has passed, leaving clear skies and clean air in its wake. I am 73 years old, a decorated veteran, a mother learning to set boundaries, a woman who chose visibility over safety. I am ordinary in the most extraordinary ways possible, and I am finally, completely, undeniably myself. Underscore 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 under. If you've ever felt invisible, dismissed, or reduced to someone's idea of what you should be rather than who you are, you're not alone. Your worth isn't determined by others' recognition, but sometimes we need to remind the world, and ourselves, of our value. Share your story of finding your voice in the comments below. Subscribe for more stories of quiet strength overcoming loud dismissal, of ordinary people revealing their extraordinary worth. Remember, you are never just what others see on the surface. Your full story is waiting to be recognized by them and by you.